Hello again everybody, and welcome back to another Python tutorial. And I think this is going to be our last tutorial in this Python Basics playlist. Although I might make some more videos on tips and where to go from the basics, but this will probably be the actual last hands-on tutorial. So congratulations if you made it this far. No doubt there's been a lot of frustrations along the way as you made a lot of beginner mistakes, just like I have. So we're going to wrap this up by talking about error handling. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's two main types of errors we can separate here. There's syntax errors, like if you miss a colon or a quotation mark to end a string or something, but these will generally get caught right away when you try to run your program. But there's another type of error, generally called an exception, that will get caught as your program runs because the syntax of your program can be correct, but it might throw an error because of an unexpected behavior. So let's head into VS Code and see what I mean by this. So here in error1.py, I have 5 divided by 0. This will throw a zero division error because dividing by 0 is not defined behavior in mathematics. So in the script, there are no syntactic errors, but if I run this, it'll still throw an error, or as they like to say in Python, raise an error. So if I go down to the terminal and type in python error1.py and run it, you'll see that I get this traceback zero division error. And my print statement on line 5 never got to execute because as soon as it raised this exception, the program didn't know what to do and it just raised the error and killed the program. So most likely you don't want your program to react quite this drastically when it comes into an error like this. You want to handle it and maybe ask the user to do something differently or just have the program skip over it entirely if this were to happen. And to do this, we can use what's called the try except blocks. So what you do is you surround the code that you're scared might throw an error with a try, and then you indent the code inside that try block. And then outside of the try block, you can make an except block. And this is what exception you expect to be thrown. So I'm going to copy this division by 0 error. And notice I did want the colon on the end there because a block of code is coming. And oftentimes what people will do is maybe just print out what that error is. So what they'll do is they'll say as E. So print out this exception as E, or store this exception as E rather. And that's very much like if you watch my last tutorial on files, how we said with open some file as F. F standing for file, here E is just like a variable for error. And then what I actually want to do is just print out that error message. Now if I save this and run the code again, you'll see we just get printed out division by 0, and this time it lets you go into the rest of the program and it prints out the print statement on line 7. Now one thing to note is that the first exception it hits within the try block is what will be handled. So if you have another piece of code you're worried about, you might not want to have that same piece in the same try block, or there's other fancy methods you can do to handle those. So I made a list up on line 1, and if I, below my 5 divided by 0, try to index names index 3, well, that's outside the bounds of indexes I have in my names list because indexing starts at 0. So we have James at 0, Samantha at 1, and Bill at 2. So if I say 3, it'll throw an index error. So I'm actually going to call that outside of my try first. And let's run the program. And you see I get an index error. So now if I put this inside of my try and underneath the 5 divided by 0, only the 5 divided by 0 will be detected because in a try statement, like I said earlier, the first exception it sees will get raised, and that is what will get handled. So I'm going to clear the terminal, and I'm going to run it again, and you see we get the division by 0 and the print statement down below executing, and it didn't even worry about this index error. And vice versa, if we put the index error ahead of the zero division error by switching lines 4 and 5, it would catch only the index error and not the division error. So let's see how we can deal with that by going over to error2.py. So I have the same list here, but this time I put an if and an if-else statement inside the try block. And when I was first learning Python, I was confused about the difference between an if block and a try block. An if block isn't to deal with errors, it's to test logical things like if user input equals the string of 1, where a try except is to catch these different exceptions that can be thrown in your program, whether it be an index error or a zero division error. So hopefully you don't get confused by that like I did. Alright, and in this if statement, I'm saying that if the user enters 1 or 2, do different things. So if the user enters 1, do the zero division error. If the user enters 2, then do the index error. And what you'll see is I can catch multiple excepts with the same try block by simply adding another except down at the bottom. So now let's try this program by running error2.py. And if I enter 1, you'll see we get the division by 0 caught. And if I run it again and enter 2, we get the list index out of range. The other thing you can do is say, if either of these errors are thrown or raised, I want to treat them the same way. And how you can do that is you can just take the other exception you're expecting and put a comma, and then you need to make a tuple out of them. And remember, tuples just have parentheses and comma separated values. Well, in some cases you don't even need the parentheses, but we'll put them here. And then I can just get rid of the extra except at the bottom. Now instead of printing out E, I'll just print out did the same thing to show that if either exception is thrown, we'll do the same thing. So I'll run it again, and if I enter 1, it says did the same thing. And if I run it again and enter 2, it says did the same thing again. Now normally you'll only want to use this feature if the errors are very similar type of errors. A zero division error and an index error aren't really the same thing, so probably not wise to just print a generic statement for both these kinds of errors. So let's go over to error3.py, and another thing you can do is accept all kinds of errors with a catch-all just plain except, with no specific error defined. So we have the same list and user input as before, but now I added a dictionary with just some dummy data. And after testing the user input on line 10, I'm just calling myDict with the key of key2, which we can see is clearly not in the dictionary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run error3, and when it asks for user input, I'm just going to put 3, because then both the if and the elif won't execute, and it'll go on to line 10, where I'm trying to call that dictionary key. And so it says there was an error because that error was caught by that catch-all except at the bottom because it wasn't a division error or an index error. But you have to be very careful with this because that can make it really hard to detect where the error actually is in the code if you're just catching all other exceptions. So I would not recommend using this on a frequent basis. But once again, it's a feature that is offered, so I thought I'd show it to you. Let's go on to error4.py. Now what if there's some code that I want to run if no error is thrown? So I have the same list of names we've been using at the top, and then inside the try block on line 4, I'm trying to take the index of our names list of 3, which we know we don't have, and assign it to a variable called name. And then outside of the try, I'm trying to print out that name variable. So let's try it. And you'll see we get a name error because it failed on line 4, and so the except ran and it just said list index out of range, but then it didn't assign the name variable because that try block failed. And so that's a key concept to realize with these try blocks is it's kind of the idea of it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. So it's kind of like, hey, try this, and if it doesn't work, then we'll handle it. But if it does work, just go on and keep running as usual. So what we could do is use an else. Now an else has to come after an except. And if there's multiple excepts, it has to come at the very bottom. So there needs to be at least one except, and the else always needs to come at the bottom. And now we can move that print name inside the else, and so it'll only try to print out the name if there is no exception thrown. So let's run it again. You see this time it didn't try to print it out, but if I print out index 2, which is in the list, and run once more, we get Bill printed out. So remember, an else will only execute if an exception was not thrown. And honestly, I don't know how super useful this is, but there is a use for it, so I thought I'd show you. But I know a lot of people just don't use else's at all. And lastly, let's look at error5.py. So there's one last thing we're going to look at, and that is the finally block you can add on to these try blocks. This will run whether or not the code fails. So if it fails, it'll run. If it doesn't fail, it'll run. This is good for like cleaning up resources, like closing a file like we saw in our last Python tutorial, working with files, that you always want to close the file once you're done with it. So for example, if something in the try block was working with a file and an exception was thrown, we want to make sure that file was closed. So that would be a smart thing to put in the finally block. So that's how finally is different from else. Else will only run if it didn't fail. Finally will run in either situation. So if I go ahead and run error5, you'll see we get an error because the list index is out of range. So the else does not run. It does not print the name because else only runs if it doesn't fail. And then we get the prints from the finally printed out in the console as well. But now let's change names index to 2, which should work. And let's run it again. And now we get no exception printed out, and we get the else ran, which prints Bill, and the finally prints again because finally will print no matter what. Another difference with finally is you don't need an else or except, so I could comment these out. And if I save and run again, it should work. And it does. Now I don't know that it would ever be smart to run without at least one except, but you don't need an else to use a finally. Alright, so that's going to do it for the basics of using try and except blocks in Python and error handling. and also for the Python Basics playlist. So I hope you enjoyed and hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions on this, please leave it in the comments down below. Please give the video a thumbs up as well, because that really helps the channel out. And smash that subscribe button if you want to see more programming and computer content like this. Also, you can check out my Patreon and donate any dollar amount per month if you found this playlist added value for you. And as always, I hope you have a nice day, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.